Before I get started today, I was asked to make sure everyone knows that the Universal Healing Circle will be right after the service, and Courtney's going to lead it today. So I wanted to make sure you all knew that. I had that in my beginning part, and I forgot. So we're starting a series this month. I'm calling it the Avatar series. Avatars being those humans that come to this planet and they get connected with the divine in a way that's different than most folks. Why is this important? I remember in my journey when the day I realized that God wasn't a Christian. It's like, really? I thought he was a Mennonite, actually. But he wasn't a Jew, he wasn't Muslim, he wasn't a Taoist. It was just God. And then the next step to that for me was to realize that Lao Tzu wasn't a Taoist either, or Jesus wasn't a Christian, or Buddha wasn't a Buddhist. None of that existed when they were here on the planet. It was ideas put together by us human beings trying to make sense out of something that we couldn't even wrap our minds around. And a lot of this came out of a time when most people didn't write, didn't read. So it was all oral tradition. So what happened in that process for me, as I began, and I've talked about this a little bit when I left the Mennonites at 13 or 14, and didn't want anything to do with God or Jesus or anything else, what spoke to me was the Taoist. They made sense to me. The Eastern philosophers made them a whole lot more sense to me because they spoke for me in clarity. They kind of called what it was instead of having these obtuse names that I couldn't figure out and didn't make sense for me. And my journey came back to and Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore are the ones who brought me back to reading basically the red words that Jesus wrote or said. He didn't write, he said. And when I looked at this, I began to understand as we teach in unity that it's omniscience is all wisdom, all knowledge, present everywhere. And if we really believe that's true, which I do, then it seemed to me that if I began to look around in the history and the conscious evolution, I would see signs along the way that other enlightened people were also talking about the very same thing. It only made sense to me that the only way I could begin to prove this omnipresent omniscient is to find these signposts along the way. All wisdom present everywhere, no matter what religion, what culture, what language. And this has been my study, and my study actually when the Taoist, I was reading the Tao Te Ching one day, and I was reading that if you try to name the Tao, it's no longer the Tao, right? When I said, well, I could put God in there. When I try to name God, it's no longer God, it's just my concept of God. It's a mental human concept. It doesn't include all of God. And so when we begin to look around, and we're going to take these 4 Sundays and look for signs where we can see whenever it occurred in history, does it make sense with what we've been teaching and what we learned? And if it doesn't, then we need to throw this out. That's kind of my take has always been on my spiritual journey. If you can't explain the how-to, then we throw it out. What good is it? So truth should show up to be absolute and not relative. Now we all know what relative truth is, right? We see that all around us everywhere. Well, the truth, my truth is whatever I make it up to be. That's relative truth. Absolute truth is it never changes. And so it needs to show up. If it's going to be absolute truth, we should be able to see it. One God, one spirit, one body, one mind, one soul. If that's true, we should be able to see it through the evolution of consciousness through time and through the history of all of the humans. And what I found is one truth, different voices, different words, based upon the culture, based upon the society, based upon the time that it might be. So I chose Shankara for the first one. How many of you here have studied Shankara? Shankara was an amazing person that saved a whole major religion in this world, Hinduism. Because Hinduism was falling in disrepair in India. And one of the reasons, I believe, is if any of you have ever looked at the Vedas or the Upanishads, you will find some very difficult reading. And part of what he did, which is why he attracted me, he boiled it all down into 5 or 6 sentences. To me, that's the genius of the folks who can take not the 500 pages of fluff, but can find the 5 sentences that say, wow. And that's what he taught. So he lived from 788 to 820 AD. I want to put this in context. He lived in India 700 years before Christopher Columbus sailed the seas. This is way back then. And one of the things that he did in the process is begin to make sense in a practical way that the folks of India who could study it. And what I love about what he did, he called it the yoga of non-dualism. And the reason I chose Shankara first is because he called his philosophy what it was. Yoga, according to Yogananda, stands for the union with God. The union of God is what the word yoga means in Sanskrit. So the union of God occurs in non-dualism. What is non-dualism? Not two. Oneness. One. So he put it right out there in the very beginning. He said the union with God or the union with the divine occurs when you move from the world of belief in 2 powers to one. Non-dualism is a Sanskrit way of saying oneness. And when you think about that, just connects with everything we've done the last 3 weeks, right? So that tells you right off as 1,200 years ago, he was talking about the things that you and I are talking in unity today. And then you will hear me say this over again. There's never anything new under the sun. It's just a different way to explain the truth. But let's look at what he said. Oh, before we do, he came from very common means, but he was a child prodigy. At 8 years old, he was in the temple teaching out of the Vedas in Sanskrit. Now, I don't know about you, think back to when you were 8 years old. But no different than what Jesus was doing at 12, teaching in the Hebrew, teaching the Torah to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So it appears that these child prodigies come along every once in a while. And they somehow come in, I don't know, old soul, that is able to be at that place in time, that has an understanding of the Vedas, to teach it in Sanskrit. What's so interesting how we see parallels here, he transitioned at 32 years old. Not here long. Very similar to Jesus. Teaching at 12, was gone at 33. 800 years after that, we have, in India, a very similar kind of situation happening. But let's look at some of the words that he uses. The one God, he uses the word Brahman. No different if you use source, the infinite spirit, God. Whatever word, you hear me say this all the time, whatever word works for you. Because you're going to see in his teachings 1,200 years ago, he talked about it. The divine within can be Atman or self, and I've capitalized self because what I love about the teaching, and this is what I got connected with, I had an easier time in my life at that time to be able to see self with a capital S as the divine within me was easier for me than to understand Christ. I just had a disconnect with that word for a long time. But it means the very same thing. But this is all about self with a capital S. No different than what we've been talking about, I with a capital I, we italics to make a difference, from little I with a dot. So you have little self, little s, being the human self or the ego. We have the big S being this other self, but yet we're still one. So we have how do we connect those dots? Here's an interesting thing. As you know, I've talked about this. I studied Paramahansa Yogananda through Roy Eugene Davis when we were in Asheville, and his whole teaching was the essence of self-realization with a capital S. So you can see the tie-in how he came to the United States in the 30s, was out in California, and really taught meditation and yoga, the union of God yoga, through self-realization, capital S. So when we look at these, all these words are the same: self-realization, God consciousness, Christ consciousness, I am presence. It's something other than the human piece of us, whatever you want to call that, so that you understand in oneness they come together. It's exactly what he was teaching. My kingdom, you know, we hear in Jesus' teaching is of this world and my kingdom. Well, my kingdom for him is bliss, or the word heaven is bliss. How many of you lived in bliss this week? Yeah, it's a good place to be. But it kind of comes and goes, doesn't it? And every once in a while you're there and it's like, oh, where'd it go? And then it's one of those things. But that's what he was calling this, what happens to us when we're in a place within us connected with the divine, he calls bliss instead of heaven. And this world is called Maya, or illusion, or hypnosis. It's believing that it's real and it's not. And we see that all the time. The teaching that we saw in Jesus was judge not by appearance is exactly the same thing as understand it's Maya or understand it's an illusion. The truth behind that is what this is all about. And as we connect with that truth, the S, we move into the S with the big S, capital S. That self. I love, again, when I say he just lays it out there. It's not obtuse trying to figure out what is the goal here. He said the goal is direct experience of our true self with the capital S. Direct experience, not studying it, not listening about it, not talking about it, doing it. Principle number 5 again. And you can see the connections already where we connected. One of the reasons why I was attracted to Charles Fillmore's teachings when I wouldn't have anything to do with that is because Charles studied the Eastern religions a lot and built a lot of that into his teachings, never calling it that because at that time, 120 years ago, he probably couldn't in the middle of Missouri of the United States. But you'll see connections here. It's the direct experience of our true self, not little s, the human self. The true self is infinite, eternal, existence, awareness, bliss. Is that any different than the way we describe the divine in a unity? Omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing, and eternal. Good. And it leads to human liberation or bliss. We see the very same thing, right? We see the things when we drop awareness and awareness of appearances in the human. What happens is we begin to have this experience of oneness with all living things. That is probably a definition that Shankara would use for bliss. And it's exactly what our true nature is. And we're guided to live there 24/7. That would be his definition of heaven on earth, is bliss. We've heard this before, haven't we? The direct experience does not occur in the realm of thought or intellect. We so want it to be true. But 1,200 years ago, it was taught that it cannot happen in the intellect, in the mind. It has to transcend that, to connect so that we have that experience of bliss. The words are pointers, and what is important to see what the words are pointing to. Centuries have been spent arguing over the right word for God. And they missed the whole essence of the teaching. Forget about the words. Use the words to point you to the direct experience. And if you're not having the direct experience, I would suggest to you you're probably tied up in the intellect. Transcend it. And we'll see how he talks about doing that. Give up that mass of flesh that we call our I or me. Transcend that. Move to another place beyond that. Big S. And his teaching was this, and I love this, because this is kind of how it's all worked for me too, is read the quotes very slowly, he says, and then ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1, what is the purpose of this quote? And number 2, what do I need to do to put it into practice, to make it a direct experience? I think those are pretty good instructions. Pretty clear-cut, pretty direct. It allows us to take these quotes, and this is what I call contemplative meditation. I take a scripture, I take a statement of truth, and I take it within. That's part of the beginning of my practice in the mornings and at night. And that's what he's saying here. Take these, and he says over and over again, just take the ones that connect. And you'll see a bunch of them today. Take the ones that connect, and it's like, wow, that's one that I need to pay attention to. How do you know? Because you feel it. It has to be part of the direct experience. And he went on to say that my teachings, my learning, my wisdom comes through the Bhagavad Gita, which to him was kind of the Cliff Notes version of all the ancient teachings. And you're going to see a lot of connection back and forth between the two. I can't read that back there. It's washed out. The world, like a dream full of attachments, seems real until we awaken. That's that whole moving beyond the intellect. Moving beyond what he calls illusions or Maya into what is true cause, which is spirit. No different than what we've been studying all along. So he gives 9 keys. And I'm going to quickly go through these today and not spend a whole lot of time, but I just wanted to open you up to the teachings and for you to see where they connect the dots. So he says, number 1, these are 9 keys to self with a capital S realization, or moving you to a liberation, another word for freedom, or bliss. So the first one is discrimination between the eternal and the temporary. This is something you and I have to do. This is what we've talked about over and over again, right? Judge not the appearance, judge righteously, with the right thinking, knowing what the cause is versus the effect. Joel Goldsmith calls it spiritual discernment. It's a gift that we are given if we ask, for the ability to know what is true and what is the illusion as we move forward. When our false perception is corrected, misery ends. Where's the false perception corrected? In me, in you. So it doesn't matter what someone else says is true for them. That's their journey. It only matters for you, and the misery is only corrected within our own selves. All beings are by nature pure consciousness. It's another term that he uses for God, or for Brahman. Pure. Again, it goes back to the teaching that we have that it's only good. That God is so pure, could never see bad or evil. Only knows good. He's saying the very same thing here. It's due to ignorance that they appear to be different from pure consciousness. So when we see the illusion that's occurring around us, you and I are just not aware of what the truth is, and we can move beyond. Pain belongs to one, identifying oneself with their body. One who does not identify oneself with their own body is free from pain. Pain is an illusion. It's an effect, not a cause. Again, 1,200 years ago, this teaching was available to all of us to learn and to begin to implement as we go forward. What is called the ego is not a property of self with the capital S. The other functions and impurities of mind are not properties of this either. The self is without impurity. Again, we're going back to God can only be good because of the pureness of, and does not see evil, does not see bad, does not see the opposite, because when there's one power, there cannot be an opposite power to. But you and I as humans have done what? We came into the planet believing in multiple powers, but at least two, good and bad. Number 2 of the 9 keys is dispassion. The opposite of passion is the ability to detach. We talked about that in the last 3 weeks where we went to the observer position. That's the ability to get out of your emotions and out of what's going on in your head and begin to observe yourself from that dispassionate place. Because that allows that disconnect of the human emotion to begin to feel and see truth. Even when truth has been realized, there still remains a piece of the ego. That's the constant process that you and I go through. The man who is deluded imagines that the brief intervals between 2 successive periods of pain is bliss. You say, no. That's just a start. Keep moving to a place where you are in total bliss. He's putting the goal out there. Have this direct experience 24/7, and you move and transcend this human effects that we're feeling of bondage and misery. He says, no, don't settle for that. Continue on the path to go to the place of bliss. The mental concept that a particular object is attractive is the source of all desires. He believes and teaches over and over again, it's the human emotion of desire. It's a human motion of expectations which creates most of our misery. Is that not true for all of us? We expect someone to act this way. That's expectations. And when they don't, that upsets us. And he's saying, go beyond it. Have no expectations. Dan's being Dan, not good or bad, just is. Takes us to a place of dispassion, pulling back from the passion of being tied up into the human emotion. Where no such thought arises, there is no desire, and there is no bondage, and there is no misery. Just as a stone, a tree, a straw, grain, and a clod, when they die, they go back to the dust, back to the earth where they come from. What he says here, that's what happens to the human dross within us. When the fire of spirit comes, it burns it up to nothing but pureness. We align in the purity of the divine, which was our source and creator. Number 3, peace or restfulness. How important is this in today's world? Peace. You know, I now hear people say, well, you know, I'm looking for peace of mind. And what they're really looking for is peace of the soul. It's that deep peace that passes all human understanding. What does Shankara say about that? The wise say that peace comes as a result of the mind being one-pointed, constantly directed to the object of meditation. What is the object of meditation? Brahman. What is the object of meditation? Oneness with the divine. Bliss. And what he's saying here is the wise say, peace comes to us as we stay single-minded focused on that object of meditation. Number 4, self-control. The absence of ego glorification includes regarding public opinion and one's social standard with indifference. Not so easy, is it? We've been trained. Have we not? We've been raised in this, that this really is a thing and it matters. And he's saying, let it go. Because as you let it go, you have that peace. But the peace comes from these expectations, again, of that I should do this, should do this, should do this. No, he said, let it go. Go to that place where bliss is. One should give up the idea of I and my in relationship to their one's physical life. How many of us say, my car, my house, my heart, my liver? Give it up. It's not. That's the effect, he's saying. That is the essence of non-attachment. Non-attachment is, again, that dispassion, moving back from and saying, wait a minute, it's flowing through me as the divine. Non-attachment is the aid to liberation, which is how we experience bliss. Number 5, renunciation. The term renunciation implies giving up all those actions which one has previously imagined to be the source of happiness. This is one we don't like to talk about. Because when you give up the belief in two powers, it's the belief in good and bad, right? It's the belief in it is. And what he's talking about is we have to let go of all those things that we said made us happy. Because what happens to those people or places or things that make us happy, when they go away, we become what? Unhappy. He's saying, no, you don't want that. You want to be middle of the road, middle of the path, being able to understand, to let go of all that as the flow of the divine comes through, which is the source of joy and happiness. In its primary meaning, renunciation applies to giving up the objects which influence the mind or those that we set as expectations. Again, sets up that whole problem that we have within ourselves. Endurance or fortitude. This is interesting because this doesn't show up much in Jesus' teaching. There's a little bit in there where it says you got to stay the path, you got to stay on the road till you finish. Paul talks about get to the end mark, finish the race. But they talk a lot about this in the Eastern. The mind should be wholly absorbed in the consciousness of the self with the big S. The mind should be permeated by that consciousness. As we open up to that, our minds become permeated with the purity of the divine. And that other stuff is just released and let go. When all the wrong ideas have come to an end, there are no more obstacles to the attainment of the highest knowledge. In this way, eternal bliss is realized. Eternal bliss is the goal for each and every one of us. And he teaches over and over again, just like Jesus did. Just because I did it doesn't mean I'm special. It means you can do it also. And here are the 9 paths to do that. Faith. The self is the witnessing consciousness. Self with a capital S is the eternal I am. We've just studied the I am, right? It ties into Moses. 5,000 years ago was the name given by God to Moses. The difference is Moses veiled it. He said only the highest priest could use the name. And they could only say it one time a year. If not, they were struck dead. So for all those thousands of years, people like you and I didn't know the name. But here, 1,200 years ago in India, was showing up exactly what was showing up 2,000-3,000 years before with Moses coming out of Egypt with the Israelites. Same word for the divine. I, the big I, am. I love the way he says some of these things. He said, the sun is not in need of any other light, either to make itself known or to reveal other objects. It just is the sun. In the same tone, in the same way, the consciousness is inherent in the S with the capital S, makes itself known as the I, and we're right back to capital italics I. Consciousness in individuals. The I of the I am is what lies within you and I, and did 1,200 years ago in India. Number 8, self with the capital S abidance. Here's some affirmations he used. I am free from illusion. I am free from Maya. I'm free from what looks to be real in the human world, so that I can get back to cause. I am free from all the effects of illusion. I am the witnessing consciousness. Back to that place, disconnected from the human emotions of what we see and we say is real. And how do we say it's real? I am sick. Or I am whatever. Not in the oneness, not in the good. I am not limited entirely by my body or the sense organs or the intellect. Old age, death, hunger, thirst, grief, or delusions, all of these are way far from me. He would not take them in and say, this is true. These are the illusion that I let go of so that I can move to this eternal bliss. I am pure consciousness, ever free. What a powerful affirmation to have. I am pure consciousness, ever free. And to be able to live it, not talk about it, not say it, not read it, but the direct experience of this. I am total, complete, pure consciousness, and I'm ever free. And finally, number 9 is the desire for liberation. It's the freedom that we all have available to us as human beings. That person who is devoid of the consciousness of the body, of the mind, who knows the supreme reality and supreme bliss, is liberated in this life, not after we die. That teaching is gone long before it was ever taught here in the United States. You're going to have heaven after you die. No, it was taught a long time ago. Heaven on earth is available to all of us. 1,200 years ago it was. We can live in supreme and eternal bliss. I have realized eternal bliss. I am the infinite innermost self with a capital S, which is the all-pervading, taintless, and pure. That's who you and I are. It's our true self, capital S. He went on to end in his teachings, what I love how he ended this. He said, the treasure I have found cannot be described in words. The mind cannot embrace it. It cannot, back to it cannot be in the intellect. It cannot be in the mind. It's beyond the mind, transcends the mind to the place of eternal bliss. One thought, one truth, a different voice, a voice of 1,200 years ago, teaching exactly what we have just studied for 3 weeks. For me, he does it in a little bit in your face kind of ways. He doesn't hide it. He doesn't make it obtuse. It's here for you and I to pick up and move forward if we wish. Let's go to stillness, please. As we take a couple deep breaths, as we open up to the truth and the teachings of 1,200 years ago, coming out of India from Shankara. Pick up whatever speaks to you, and that doesn't, let it be. But know that there's this golden thread of truth. This golden thread of consciousness that goes through time, which is what builds confidence for me, or what builds my faith, is to know that it was being said and taught in a whole other part of the world. And just to open up to that self with the big S. And if you like, ask, guide me to that bliss. I want to have that direct experience. I want to feel that bliss. And we know that it can only happen beyond thought, in the stillness. Be still and know that I am my true self. And so it is.